Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Zed Book Club. I have Michelle Good with me from her home near Kamloops. Welcome, Michelle.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be able to join you.
I really appreciate it. Before we begin, I'd like to say the land I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa people. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. This is Michelle Good. You've all read her book, right? So Michelle has been working with Indigenous groups since she was a teenager, and she decided to go to UBC Law School in her 40s. So this is that was her second act. And we're primarily advocating for residential school survivors after graduation. She started her third act as a writer in her 50s, and a draft of Five Little Indians was her thesis for UBC's creative writing program, Master of Fine Arts. When she submitted the manuscript to HarperCollins Publishers UBC Prize for Best New Fiction, she won, which she says she was surprised about, but we'll ask her for that in a minute. Since the book's publication in 2020, it's won the Governor General's Literary Award, the Amazon Canada First Novel Award, and most recently, the Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. We're thrilled to have you with us, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I really enjoy the opportunity to speak to readers. It's very satisfying to me. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate it because we know you've done about a gazillion interviews by now.
2 gazillion.
All right, 2 gazillion. That's great. So I wanted to talk, I mean, I don't even know where to start. We have so many questions and people will be asking some. I have a couple from readers already. We'll leave that to the end. I did want to talk to you about 2 things on the cover. I want to talk about the cover art and I want to talk about the title. Okay. Now, you have done an interview already with Sumer. Thank you very much about this. And you mentioned the title obviously was this reference to racism, and there is so many instances of racism against Indigenous people in this book. You could say one of the worst is in the title. And I want to ask you or tell us why you chose part of this racist rhyme for the book.
Sure. I mean, first of all, the book was under a couple of other working titles for a while, but I felt like I hadn't quite settled on what would be the best for me and for the purposes of the book. And I was going back and forth with a friend of mine in email. How about this? How about that? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And probably about, a gazillion, potential titles. And then one day, this title just came to me out of the blue, just came to me like a gift from the heavens. And I thought about it and I thought, oh yeah, this is so it. And there's the obvious, which is, I've got my 5 protagonists, my 5 characters, my 5 little Indians, right? But the other reason was I wanted it, as soon as I thought of it, I wanted it to be right on the cover, that this is about a time in our history, still playing out today, that was founded in a fundamentally racist system, a fundamentally racist intention in terms of what the residential schools were for. And, I have taught history in the past, and one of the things that I ask my students is, what do you know about Indigenous people? Tell me. And, eventually, once everyone reaches a comfort level, they start with all the stereotypes. And then I ask them, how do you know that? And they're stunned. They can't tell me how it is that they know something that they've just, sort of put forward as a fundamental truth, right? And it's the same thing with, when did we learn, 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, and who did we learn it from? And that, I think, when we start unpacking that whole sort of racist history, that whole racist foundation to even things as simple as a nursery rhyme, then we know how deeply racism is embedded in our society. And so that's why it was really for me, the best possible title. People also have to remember that it reflects the time. This story started in the mid 60s, and the kids were leaving the school in the early 70s, mid 70s, and that's what we were referred to then. You know, the whole nomenclature was not Indigenous, was not even Aboriginal. It was just starting, you know, for people to refer to us as being Native. But by and large, it was Indian, and we are still legally Indians as per the Indian Act, as per, you know, the original Constitution, the British North America Act. We are Indians, right?
Yes.
So basically, that was my reasoning, or I guess my heart's intent.
Right.
With the
Well,
title.
it was interesting. I was just looking up a little bit of, well, this book caused me to look up much history. So I must thank you for that. I looked up I looked up if Willow Flats was real. I did know about Wounded Knee. I knew about the initial massacre, but I didn't know about the 70s movement and the self-determination. I know. So I read about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the title, I think, so 2015 was when Trudeau took the word out of the ministry, right?
Right.
Up until that point, it had been used. And so I don't know how many people, I think people know they are not to use that word anymore. But if anyone's out there, Indigenous peoples is the word that we like to use, correct? So the title, so the cover art, I know you talked a little bit about this with our interviewer previously, and I thought it was really interesting because I was going through, I reread the book again. Thank you again for that treat, because it is so powerful. The pink moon I looked up as well. So this is an April moon when it's at the highest or closest to the earth, but it's named after the flower, the ground flower, something that comes out. So I didn't see a pink moon in the book. Did I miss it? There's lots of moons and they have lots of significance.
It's really, actually, it totally blew me away when I first saw the artwork. Generally, authors don't really have a say in what the cover is going to be, because it's considered part of marketing. And so I was sent this earlier proposed cover, and it was just hideous. It was just awful. It was like someone had grabbed a bunch of wet and broken feathers and flung them at a page, and it was just like, oh no. So then we began a dialogue, and the only thing I suggested was, you know, perhaps we could get a really good photograph of birch trees, because birch are reflected throughout the book so often. And that was all I said, and this is what they came back with. And I literally gasped when I opened the email attachment and there was this proposed artwork. But for very, very personal reasons, my son died in 2013. He was my only child.
I'm sorry to hear that.
He died on the 25th of April, and it was sudden. They were unable to determine a cause of death, and it was on the full moon, and it was on the pink moon.
Wow, that is incredible.
And I have just felt from, you know, the moment that I saw that artwork, that it was my boy standing behind the artist going, pink moon, full moon, pink moon, no, I'm here, right? And you know, and it really does make me feel that way, that he's walking. I had started writing the book before he died, and he used to laugh at me and my sad stories. That's what he used to say. Oh, Mom, you and your sad stories, right? But it just makes me feel like he's walking with me on this journey, and it's beautiful. And it's also, even without all of that, you know, sort of background to it or context that I have, it's just beautiful artwork.
It is beautiful. And the upside down children, you know, how their lives have been turned upside down. The birch trees obviously are a big symbol through there of, well, I think for Clara, Clara in jail, the woman comes to her in a vision, and it's the connection to ancestors and the creator.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's the perfect cover for this little book of mine. Yeah.
It's really fantastic.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know, so the other thing I was curious about, and we talked about in our discussion, was the prologue, because books often use this literary device where they give you this prologue with a snippet of a story and you don't know who anyone is. So you read it and then off you go into the story. And I sort of forgot about it, but we were having this discussion. Everyone's like, well, what happened to Lucy? And I'm like, wait a minute, Kendra and Claire. So I read the prologue at the end after I'd finished, and it was like the ending.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like the completion of the book is what I meant. Is that what you intended with that device?
Well, I don't know, but I'll tell you a little bit about the prologue. I am not a big fan of prologues generally.
Mm-hmm.
And very often if I pick up a book, there's a prologue, I just switch, right? Because I just go past it. And but my editors suggested that the first 3 chapters of the book are so grim and so shocking and heartbreaking that we might lose readers. People might abandon the book because it's too hard to deal with. And so they wanted me to write a prologue specifically for the purpose of letting people know that there's love and hope in this book as well.
Right.
And so I wrote a prologue, sent it off, and then immediately sent an email saying, no, not that. and then wrote this prologue. And this prologue, for anybody that hasn't read the book, is, really about the patriation of a little girl or the repatriation of a little girl that dies at residential school. And that was very meaningful for me because that little girl was real.
So it was a real story, wasn't it?
It was a true factual story. And my mother witnessed her death. She was my mother's friend at residential school. And her name, Lily's name, when the CBC came out with the confirmed names of it was then about 3,000 kids that had died at residential school, I immediately checked it. And there was, and I said this in a CBC interview without realizing the double entendre,
right?
But there was a bunch of Lilies in that list that were from Saskatchewan. And when I said bunch of lilies, someone said it back to me. And then I thought, oh my God, a bouquet of lilies, right? Like a handful of lilies, right? And, so I felt that in having that in the prologue, I was not only honoring my mother's story, but I was honoring that little girl as well.
How old were you when you heard your first residential school story? Was that the first one, or did your mother tell you that later?
My mother used to refer to residential school as boarding school. And I grew up in a non-Indigenous community. And so, and I was an avid reader even as a little kid, right? And so I had this very European concept of a boarding school. And so that's why, my mother went to boarding school.
Oh my gosh.
And then when I was probably about 10, 11, these stories, snippets of stories would start to come out. And, she only talked to me. I don't know why. Maybe because, she was moved to because she knew I would write this book somewhere in her soul.
Yes.
Right. And her first story was about when she was served up with a piece of bread that a cat had peed all over. One of the sister's cats had peed on this bread supply, and she refused to eat it. And she was made to sit there for hours and hours and hours saying, you're not going anywhere till you eat it. And finally, they didn't know my mother was a force of nature, and they finally gave in, dragged her off to the principal's office, and he told her that she was nothing but an Indian slut, and she would never be anything but an Indian slut. And she was 11 years old. She was just a little kid. That story was basically the first story my mother told me. And it threw me into this profound state of cognitive dissonance, right? It's like, what? Like, this happened to my mother? And why? How could this be, right? I mean, this would have been right around Expo 67 when everybody's,
Right. Hang on, I think you're breaking up a little bit there.
It's this very big story. I'll come back. Don't worry. I'll be back.
Okay,
Am I
good.
back yet?
Yeah, you're back.
Am I yet?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I usually say that right at the beginning that I occasionally get this interruption in my internet, but because I live in the middle of nowhere. So,
Yeah.
so, but yeah, so it was just such a shocking experience. And then the next story she told me was about Lily. You know, like she literally watched this little girl hemorrhage to death. And, you know, how does that affect you in your life? How does it affect the things that you aspire to, the things you believe in, the things you choose in your life, right? And yeah, and one of the things that I believe that my mother chose as a result of her residential school experiences was to marry a non-Indigenous man. And back then you lost your Indian status
Yes.
as a result of that. So all of us kids were born without Indian status. But what that meant for my mother is that we did not go to residential school. They couldn't come and take us. And I believe that her decision, I mean, she loved my father, obviously, but part of her decision making, I believe, was to protect her prospective children, you know.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah. Now, there are so many echoes in this story of the issues that were to come out. I mean, when Lucy goes to downtown East Side and Walt preys on her, all I could think of was Robert Pickton coming downtown to find his victims. Some of them were Indigenous women, the murdered and missing Indigenous girls and women. Also the just the whole when sorry, I'm losing all the names here. When Lucy's in the hospital and giving birth to Kendra, and they come and they say, we have to say if you're a fit mother, and all that is just what Cindy Blackstock is saying, the professor at McGill, about children going into the foster system and care system, which is underfunded, and that's another cultural genocide, and that they are just the extension of residential schools.
Yeah, it's the same cultural genocide. Well, and I slipped. I don't usually use the term cultural genocide because there is no distinction in the genocide conventions of what
She says that. Yes.
Yeah, well, it's true.
Yeah.
And, you know, in the 40s after the Second World War, when they developed the genocide conventions, they had 5 definitions of genocide. And one of them was the transfer of children from one group to another, you know, with the obvious objective of, you know, annihilating a people. And that doesn't make it cultural genocide, which is sort of taken as, oh, genocide light, if you will. It's not that. It's genocide, pure and simple. And you know, the 60s scoop, you know, the residential schools started to close down, to wind down in 1969. And believe me, it was not, you know, for some benevolent intent or sense. What it was about was the people that worked in the residential schools wanted to be federal employees like all other federal employees with the same pay scales, you know, benefits, pensions, and so on. And the feds decided that's too expensive. And so they started winding down the residential schools at that time. But what came up in its place was the 60s scoop and the child welfare system, where there was, you know, institutionalized birth alerts where any Indigenous woman gave birth and a phone call was made to child services. And, you know, that continues to this day, as we know from Cindy's work. It's just quite extraordinary and awful. It's still open season on Indigenous kids. Yeah.
The part I loved about that, again, it's very dark, but then you have Clara, you know, making these fake names with Buffy St. Marie's last name, Honey Bunny, and what was the other one?
Oh, I even forget.
That was the best.
Well, and it was kind of my little homage to Buffy because she, you know, very kindly gave me permission to use the lyrics from her song, you know, without any charge or anything like that. It was so generous of her. So I really wanted to just have that little homage to her.
That's so great.
Yeah.
And but you have worked when you were, oh, yes, this is another question where I have so many, but you could have set this at a different denomination, like a religious order, but you chose Catholic, and I wanted to know why.
I chose Catholic because the vast majority of schools were run by Catholic organizations. And the other thing is that I wanted the geography of where it was, but the school that I'm basing it on in my mind was an Anglican school. And I thought if I changed the denomination, it would make it less specific. It would, so, survivors of that particular school wouldn't necessarily think, oh my God, is she talking about me? And, those kinds of things. But yes, it was the Catholic um, um, corporation that ran the vast majority of these
Right.
schools. Yeah. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate were key.
Right. And did you do research? I mean, obviously, this is the other thing, is that survivors initially didn't talk, or, we see that in the book, how they kept it bottled up and what that did to them. But then they do talk, and especially going back years before even the Survivor Speak was published in 2015, they were telling, all across the country, and even further back at the school when they're getting punished for telling the nun, she makes Lucy scrub the floor with a toothbrush and shaves her head. So they're not believed initially when they tell, then they don't tell, then they tell and no one listens. And so I was curious about the response to this book has been so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think that is right now? Or it was 2020, it was even before the residential school searches for unmarked graves and remains.
Well, quite frankly, I think, and I've said this before, is that something need not be factual in order to be true.
Yes.
And I think that there is a profound truth in these stories in this book. And I think people are able to respond to it very personally and very viscerally, because their notion was either they didn't have a notion of what residential schools were about at all, or their idea was something really, really different, much like that cognitive dissonance I experienced when my mother first started telling me the truth about her experience. But I also think it's because so many Canadians have raised that ubiquitous and awful question about why can't they just get over it? And what that's, when people say that, I respond now by saying, what exactly are you asking us to forget? Right? 130 years of taking all of our children away? You're asking us to forget that, to get over that? And I think that what it does, because that question has been so ubiquitous, at the risk of being redundant, that people have had a thought in their mind that, oh God, why can't they just get over it? I mean, it's so long ago, it's nothing, blah, right? And then to get these characters that have been very much humanized and very much presented. This was a real struggle for me to make sure, that's why it took 9 years, that they were whole people, right? That they were whole people with desires and dreams and flaws and strengths, and that they were believable characters that went through a terrible, terrible thing. And I think it's educational, and I mean, educational in a literal sense in terms of, oh my God, this actually happened, but also educational in response to that question. This is why they can't get over it. And so I think that's, really huge, or that's played a really huge role in why, it's, and it just blows me away actually that it's being received like this. I thoroughly expected that it would perform quite well as a niche book for a niche audience. And it's exactly the opposite that's happened. And it's just, I'm so happy. Every time somebody says something about it, it raises the profile, and somebody else will read it. And somebody else will, hopefully open themselves to a different understanding. Yeah.
So did you write it initially for an Indigenous audience? Is that who you imagined reading it?
I did, and in that sense, I wanted it to be, a bit of a love letter to survivors, right? But I also wanted it to be a tool in the hands of Indigenous people to say, you want the answer to that question, here it is, read this, right? And so I am just, I thought maybe some people in academia, social services, like social sciences, I mean, not social services, that they would, pick it up and be able to use it. So, yeah.
And what has been the response from Indigenous readers? Because I know a lot of, not a lot, but some of the other Indigenous writers I've talked to have been very cognizant of triggering trauma, and you're writing about something that you cannot help but do that. So how did you handle that?
Well, I have had multiple. There are something like 580 written reviews on Goodreads, right? And 4,000 and something ratings. It's just mind-boggling. But I've had lots of response from survivors, and importantly from intergenerational survivors who, you know, and I'm getting comments like, this reminds me so much of what I experienced with my mother or my father who went through residential school, and it's given me words to articulate an understanding of why and how, and to be more forgiving of them in, you know, how the challenges that they faced in becoming parents themselves out of a place of deep trauma. And you know, so I haven't had, you know, touch wood, I haven't had a single criticism that you know, and that was a real balance, right? It's like, you know, there's this term that has been applied to some works, I won't say which, where they call it trauma porn, right? Where it's just sort of almost an exploitation of the trauma itself. And that was, I mean, if you looked at the first drafts of these books, it's very, very different. And, you know, because the abuse was treated more on the nose, if you will, it was detailed, and it was, you know, very, it would have been awful, quite frankly. It would have been horrible, right? I wouldn't have read it. So. But, you know, and there was also a chapter that I had in the book at one point, because you don't want you to make your villains sort of one-dimensional, right? Writing the book. And so I had a chapter about Sister Mary's early life and what turned her into such a monster. And then I, you know, I thought, no, I don't want this in there, because it's not about them. It's not the abuser's story, and I don't want to give them any voice. I don't want to give them any justification, any explanation. They, you know, and that's why their names were Sister Mary and Brother John, right? Like as generic as you could possibly be. And so, but I tried to articulate the abuse without being as detailed as I could have been.
Yeah, I found it was very, you know, you get a hint. Like even in Maisie's chapter, when she's going out, you're like, oh, is she working the streets? Like you just get this feeling.
Yeah.
But if the words aren't really there, they're not saying it, and they're never really said until she meets the old man, and they're still not said. That was just gut punch, that chapter. And Maisie was the strong one. I mean, she was the scrappy one, but she could not handle it.
No, she couldn't. And that's, I've had people respond, you know, questioning whether she was, you know, involved in sex work, and that, no, she wasn't. That was meant to, Maisie's story was meant to describe trauma responses. And, you know, with people that suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, it's very, very common that they seek to revisit the trauma in an effort to understand or to resolve it or to make it go away, to take control of it in somehow or in some manner. And that's what that's what Maisie's behavior and her choices are about. Right. And there's some dialogue in there, her internal dialogue about all that's left is the person that Father made me. Yeah. Right. And, you know, and that was the intent of Mary's story. Yeah. Maisie's story.
Yeah, and they all have the PTSD. Just, you know, the rage is common, but, you know, Lucy's obsessive compulsive behavior. But I thought the thing that really was painted, as you say, is the intergenerational trauma. I think that was something that I really took away from this book that I didn't quite understand. So You did what you set out to do.
Well, thank you.
And I think that might be appealing for a settler audience because we're all grandmothers, mothers, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles. You think about your child being taken from you. And so I think it's got to be where it goes. You know, it just has to be, your mind goes. I mean, that scene where Kenny comes home on the beach, there's no children in his village. And all of a sudden you realize, what if it was a small village and every child is gone?
Well, they were. It's not what if. They were. Every school-age child was gone, period. And when you think about that, and this is what I say often when I'm discussing this book, is that part of my intent was also to demonstrate that we didn't just experience this as individuals. We experienced it collectively as a people, because the role of parent and grandparent, the roles were disabled because they took those children away. And the grandparents whose role and responsibility is to pass on the cultural knowledge, the traditional knowledge, is just completely, taken away, just destroyed. It doesn't, it's gone. And, there were two chapters where I have two kids that go home, when Kenny goes home, and there's the no kids, but there's also the breakdown of the relationship when you're gone for 10 years. And, from the time you're a little wee kid until you're 16, or he was a bit younger. But this came up with Maisie as well.
Maisie went home and she was like, who are these strangers pretending to be my family?
Yeah, and I can't even, and not even being able to remember what they look like. And imagine the last time you saw your parent, you were 6 years old. And now you're going back and you're basically a young adult, and, you can't, as tall as your parents, right? And that.
That woman came up to Maisie on the beach and said, Sally?
Yeah, no, I'm not Sally, right? And, that story about them being taken up the coast on a boat and being on a beach, that's a true story.
Where did you get these from? Where did you do your research?
Well, I started a master's of law, and then we had some family issues and I had to withdraw. But I did all the research, and it was supposed to be about the history of the residential schools. So all of that stuff was, I had it down pat, right? And it was before the TRC, it was before, like John Malloy's book that came out about the history of all of that. It was before all of that, but I had it down pat.
These were real stories that you had researched?
No, I mean, like the history of the residential.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. But the other thing is I didn't have to research these stories, because basically my entire cohort were residential school survivors. When I started working with Indigenous organizations in the early, almost mid-70s, virtually everybody that I was working with was a residential school survivor. And so I got firsthand to observe how they interacted with the world while carrying this tremendous psychological or burden of psychological injury. That was just my life. So I didn't have to learn about it. I was living it in my relationships with other people, right? But also because I practiced law in that area specifically and exclusively for so many years, colleagues that I worked with would often say, like there was a support person up in the Yukon that used to attend our hearings to support survivors. And he was the one that actually told me about that, that he had, he knew somebody that was the way they were brought home.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought it was very satisfying when Howie beat almost killed father, I have to say. I wish he had. But that monster, like, where did you get that monster? I mean, the thing is, again, very subtle, right? You find out from Kenny, he's abused. You find out about Howie, then you find out about the girls, then you find out about another girl, and you're like, oh my God, this guy never stopped.
Yeah. Having worked, representing survivors, I was made painfully aware of the nature of abuse that kids suffered at these schools. And, anybody that wants to know that just need go to the testimony that survivors provided at the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. And that's where that comes from, right? That's where the nature of the abuse comes from, is just the record, so to speak. And, and again, from friends and relatives, my cousins all went to residential school, and, the stories that they told me over time as well. So, yeah.
I thought it was interesting that Clara, becomes this activist who crosses the border with her dog, John Lennon. So we know another one of your favorite artists.
Actually, that's not why I named him John Lennon, right? I mean, I love John Lennon, right? Yeah. But I worked in a community in northern British Columbia, and the chief then, he's not the chief now, but he was the chief, and his mother had two dogs, one named John Lennon and the other named Yoko Ono. And so it was a little homage to my friend and his mother's dog.
What about Billie Holiday, the great?
No, that was mine. I just created Billie.
So Clara gets, she gets galvanized at the Friendship Center. She meets Vera and George, and she gets involved in the Wounded Knee, the self-determination movement, the traditionals versus the
American Indian movement.
Yes, the American Indian movement. Yeah. And but I thought it was interesting that she's galvanized to do this, yet she was so resistant to Mariah's healing and to her teachings. So she was open on the one hand to resistance, but not open to the ancestors and the ceremonies.
There were children in the residential schools whose tongues were pierced with needles to,
oh my God. So they wouldn't speak.
Whenever they spoke their own language, they would be, subject to atrocities like that, to, filling their mouths with soap, to, all kinds of terrible punishments. And so what I wanted to portray with Lucy's resistance to the cultural healing that was being made available to her was how deeply it entrenched in these kids that it was devil worship, that they were going to burn in hell, that, imagine, things that were told were 6 and 7 years old, right? And it's followed up with physical violence, right? It's not here. It's so deeply entrenched in your psyche.
Right.
But the American Indian movement, Clara was just the most rageful person because of Lily, right? Because of what happened to her friend, to Lily.
Yes.
This was the place where she could express that, right? For Lucy, it wasn't about self-determination or politics or any of that kind of stuff. It was about, pardon my French, a big F you, right? It was about the rage that she needed a place to express. But it was also, she understood what George was saying to her. There's that one scene where John Lennon is running out in the field and there's all the purple flowers, right? And George has talked to her about, you're not a weed, you're an indigenous flower, right? And George really reached her and, took that horrible estimation of herself that she had been, conditioned to believe, and gave her another way of thinking about it. Mariah filled out the circle, if you will, by giving her a sense of safety and a sense of freedom from that trauma. And so, so I really wanted to talk about that struggle that we feel when we're when we're subjugated in that way, and when our culture is treated as though it's heathen and pagan and dirty and horrible, right? And punishable under law. Yeah.
I
So,
thought I want to talk just a little bit. We'll go to some questions from the readers soon, but I just want to ask about, I mean, I know you are a member of Red Pheasant Cree Nation. It appears in the story. It's where Howie's from and where his mother dies while he's locked up for the crime of
yeah,
meting out justice for father. And Mariah is also in Saskatchewan and sort of in the bush. And I thought it was interesting that there were no Indigenous words. I've often seen some until later in the book. There are some Cree words.
yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about putting Saskatchewan in there. We had the Howie that gets grabbed when he's in BC, which is also crazy.
Yeah.
It was something you knew, obviously. And why did you put some Cree words in? And you even mentioned the shapeshifter, whose name I could attempt.
Oh, Wisakijak.
Wisakajak. That's it. Wisakajak. And and I need to ask you, what does Astamikwa mean when Mariah?
Astamikwa, come to me now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I figured that's kind of what it meant.
Yeah.
So you talk about the ancestor who Red Pheasant's named after, who signed the Treaty 6, I think, in the 1870s, but you don't give a background, and you talk about Wisakajak. Wisakajak. Thank you. That's better. Wisakajak.
Yeah.
So Howie remembers his mom telling the story, but we don't get the story. So I just was curious. Again, you're giving us little bits, but not a fuller picture, and why.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think, part of it obviously was that, for my mom and for myself, I wanted to have Red Pheasant in there, and also for my living cousins and aunties, right? Like, I wanted to just immortalize our little reserve a little bit. And, and also at that time, the language, well, it still is. Cree is one of the few Indigenous languages that, and Inuktitut, that is very solidly still alive, right? And, and I wanted to try to express, how, I guess how the language was still so alive and so a part of daily conversation, and something that you just learned naturally the way we learn English in our lives.
Right.
But there really wasn't a lot of room or place in the story to sort of go into more depth about this or that, about, the story of Wisakijak or those kinds of things. So it just, I just wanted to weave in some language for the simple beauty of it. So. Yeah.
I want to ask you where you stand on the word survivor, since you do use it, and Justice Murray Sinclair in the introduction to the Survivor Speak talked about how they debated whether they would pick another word because they thought it conveyed sort of just getting by or broken down, but he cites a poem called Invictus and said it's the right word. So how do you feel about that?
I'm okay with survivor, because I think we need to acknowledge that these people did survive. Not only the people, but our culture and our communities survived this violent act of colonialism. This was a key implement in the colonial toolkit, and we're still here. It was well stated, fully and completely and unabashedly stated, that this was to absorb every last Indian into the body politic. And, by the fathers of Confederation. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And we are here, we survived that, but we're not, we are more than our trauma, and so much more than our trauma. And, survivor is one aspect of our reality. But, we are many things too. We are thrivers. And we're tough, and we don't give up, and we're not going to.
Well, I think a couple of book club, our discussion, one of the people was taking the U of A course. I've started as well, because we recognize that there's been massive holes in our education.
Yeah.
I went to school in Nova Scotia. A history teacher made great care to talk about the Black population in Nova Scotia and where they came from. And there were children there from the reserve who were not even spoken to. And, you talk about that now and you're like, how could that even happen? So it's been, I think people are ready. I think they are ready, and they're ready to listen, and they're ready to learn. We have a ton of questions, but two quick things. One is, this is being made into a TV series?
Maybe.
Maybe, okay.
Prospero Pictures has picked up the option. And
Mhm.
so now, of course, we have to find budget.
Yes. Okay.
And,
Oh, you broke up a little bit there. You're almost back.
Okay, don't worry.
Yeah, there you are. You're back.
Okay.
And also,
here I am.
yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. So maybe TV series, but also you're writing.
Right.
We can expect more from you. We have another book coming about the Northwest, or set in the Northwest Rebellion. Is that true?
No.
No.
It's set in that time frame, but it's not about the Métis resistance. It's
yes, and it's about your ancestors, is it not?
Yeah, it's the main character is loosely based on my great-grandmother, who was born in 1856, and there's a beautiful symmetry because I was born in 1956, and
oh my gosh.
She is a very compelling character because she did not even see a non-Indigenous person until she was in her late teens, maybe even as old as 20. But she was with
how do you know, sorry, I wanted to interrupt, because how do you know that story?
How do I know that story?
Yeah.
Through oral tradition, through my mother's stories to me.
Okay.
Anyway, so she would have been with Big Bear because that was her uncle,
Right.
at the Frog Lake so-called massacre. And then subsequently, when the Northwest Mounted Police were dispatched to dispatch them,
Mhm.
and they were chased through the Cypress Hills and into Montana.
Mhm.
And ultimately, I mean, Big Bear was arrested and charged with treason.
Mhm.
But the band stayed in Montana for many years. There was ultimately an amnesty, and they were pushed in. Those that wanted to go back to Canada were put into a boxcar, like, check out that visual.
Yeah.
And to this day, there is a band in Alberta that is known as the Montana Band of Cree. My grandfather ultimately brought my great-grandmother back to Saskatchewan, but so it's that story of that whole time in history where, because they were being starved, because all the buffalo had been killed off, and they were starved into signing treaty. Now I've just lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. And they were worried about TB and diseases. Weren't they being decimated too by European diseases, right?
By European diseases as well. But yeah, so it's that whole story. So there's going to be lots of action and really exciting stuff. But also what I'm trying to do with this story is to write in the same way that I wrote Five Little Indians, to humanize the colonial effort, right? The impact of the colonial effort, so people can understand it. And in particular, the basis for the acceptance of violence against Indigenous women. Mm. Because a lot of people don't know this, and I suggest you read Clearing the Plains by James Dashik. Okay. But in the fur trade, when they were first trying to pressure Indigenous men to trap for the Hudson's Bay profit and for the fur company's profit, they would hold Indigenous women hostage. They would hold their wives hostage and say, yeah, your wife can go home again once you agree to do this. So, and it gets even worse. It gets even worse. And so I want to talk about that because I think people are stuck in wrong-headed thinking about why Indigenous women are preyed on. And so I want that to be one of the underpinnings of this particular story. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions, like a lot of questions. So I'll try. I mean, we're getting close to the end here, so I'll try. One came up in our discussion too was about Lucy. Everyone's saying, like, what happened to Lucy? Because she's not with Kendra and Clara at Mariah's in the prologue. And the last thing we know, Kenny dies and she buys the house. I assume she's just in Vancouver, right? Nothing happened to her?
No, nothing happened to Lucy. You know, Lucy is doing what Lucy wanted to do. She bought the house, but she gave it to Kendra. She wanted to stay in the house that she had lived with Kenny in. And so Lucy's just living her life, being Lucy. Yeah.
Here's a funny one. Quite often, this from Carol, quite often authors portray one character as more like themselves. Am I correct in thinking that you would be Clara?
I hear that a lot, and maybe, but I'm not cognitively and not intentionally, that's for sure. And I think sometimes people go there because Clara becomes a court worker. She ends up working in the judicial system, but it wasn't intentional. If it's true, it could be, but it wasn't intentional. Yeah.
Okay. So here's one. What do you think about adding the book to the high school curriculum in English, in either English or history? My first thought would be fantastic, but might be too difficult. And my thought would be, would you really want a white teacher teaching the book?
I think the book teaches itself.
Yeah.
I think the book teaches itself. And yeah, I would love it if it was in every high school across the country, every first year English course in universities. I would just be absolutely delighted. There are a couple of high schools I know because I've spoken to the group that read the book, and it was grade 11 and 12 mixed class, and they got it. They were fine. And we have to realize that these young people today, next I'm going to say, get off my lawn, right? Young people today can access any kind of horror that they want on the internet. Yeah. And I think they are more desensitized than perhaps I would have been when I was in high school, and more capable of absorbing this, especially with more and more information being in the public domain about the kinds of abuses. But this one class in particular basically warned students, particularly about Maisie's chapter, and gave them the option of reading that chapter or not, right? And I thought that was a good strategy. So, yeah.
So this question's come up a couple of times. Are any of your characters based on people you know?
No, absolutely not, and intentionally not. It's very sensitive to be a lawyer and then to go and, who represented survivors and then go write a book about survivors, right? And, I took great pains to make sure that they were not representative of where any of my clients came from, or, their names or the schools they went to or anything like that. So no, they're not based on real characters. Yeah. People. So
this is something that really puts the onus on you to educate. So it's up to you whether you want to answer it. But someone asked about using the word Indian. If we're not allowed to use it, why do some? This person had seen a Thomas King interview who was laughing about it, and said it's not a problem for us, it's a problem for you. So right. I'm trying to be aware and respectful, they write, but this makes me feel confused.
Oh, don't be confused. It's simple. It really is quite simple. When you think about it, if you apply that to Black people, African Americans, who will often refer to themselves using the N-word, but it's not okay for other people to use the N-word. Even today in 2021, me and my friends refer to each other as Indians, right? It's just sort of become part of the culture for us, right? It's not derogatory when we are using that terminology.
Yes.
But you have to think of the adjectives that were often associated with that word.
Right.
Indian, stupid Indian, dirty Indian, freeloader Indian, welfare bum Indian, all those, sort of derogatory adjectives that are added to it. That's why we say, no, you can't refer to us that way. But if we so choose, that's our prerogative.
Right. I think it was, our audience is older, and we do a lot, we have a lot of stories that have lots of generations, but I think you're a particular inspiration because you've had so many lives. And I wondered if you just tell me what it is inside that made you say, okay, I'm going to go be a lawyer. Okay, now I'm 50 something, I'm going to go be a writer.
I think I was sent to Earth with a drive that was sort of off the charts, right? Because when I was in grade 6, okay, I was in grade 6, and our teacher did this exercise of, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Right.
I wanted to be either a forensic psychiatrist or a lawyer. How did I even know what any of those things are, right? And I don't know. I'm just a weirdo. I was a weird little kid. I was that, same with writing as well. I was that kid at about 10 or 11 walking around with a journal all the time.
Right.
And I think in terms of writing, we are born that way, not made. We have a certain character where we observe, we consider, we record. And I've been doing that all my life. I just decided I wanted to publish something. So yeah.
Someone just asked, will it be important to you to involve Indigenous writers and producers if the book gets made into a series?
The screenwriter is Cree.
Okay.
And we, of course, are not at a point where we would be hiring a director or anything like that. But I have one in mind who is legitimately Indigenous.
Legitimately.
And can prove it.
Yes. Yes, there's been a bit of that going on these days.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the primary reasons to accept that option agreement with Prospero, was because the writer is Cree. And also the writer insisted on, I didn't even have to ask for it, insisted on my involvement in developing the screenplay and the scripts. So yeah, so I'll be there to make, and I told them, and it's true, my major priority with the development of that project is that it's true to the book, true to the heart of the book. And so I'll make sure.
Will you be writing it? Or no, you said someone else would write it. Yeah,
it's a Cree screenwriter who will write it. I'm not a screenwriter. I probably could if I put my mind to it, but it's not what I do. And but I am the person that will tell her if she's got it right or not.
Right, of course you are. Now, you said at the beginning that you were writing this in 2013, as your son said, these sad stories. 2011, right. Yeah. What did it look like, the first draft?
Oh, it was dreadful. See, I went to do the MFA program because I decided if you're going to write this book, you got to do it now. You're getting old, right? And so, but I was also at the same time running my little law firm. And I mean, there was one time where I had 13 hearings in 20 days in 5 different geographical locations.
Right.
And I was doing the MFA. So I went there to write this book in particular, but I had to learn how to write a novel. And so, so the first one, had all of the, rookie writer mistakes in it and so on. And
like what?
No.
Come on. People here want to write books. They want to know what to avoid.
Okay. Too much telling, not enough showing, didactic dialogue, right? Long exposition, in the form of people speaking, making little speeches and so on, instead of just, speaking to each other. Obtuse imagery and metaphor and, all of those kinds of things. So, but it was the core, it was the beginning. And the best thing about that first draft was that my characters were themselves immediately in that first draft.
Oh, so you had the 5 already?
Yeah, oh yeah. I knew. Yeah. I wrote the first paragraph of this book in a UBC MFA workshop. And as soon as I wrote that paragraph and made everybody cry, I knew that I needed more characters in order to have the fullness of what people experienced in these schools. And the way I actually developed the characters, I know everybody wants to know, is it based on real people? Is it based on real people? Is what I did was I took, I've read hundreds of psychological assessments, and I took the types of injuries that my characters suffered, the abuse, the nature of the abuse that they suffered. And then I looked at what the psychological consequences of that are. And then I asked myself, so with that injury, with those lasting harms, how would they evolve and grow? What
Mhm.
kind of an adult would they become? And
Right.
that's how I developed each of those characters, right?
So by the
So-
time you left, you had this manuscript that you submitted that was almost final?
No, well,
No?
I submitted my thesis, but then
Yeah.
the manuscript that I ultimately submitted to HarperCollins was like a whole different manuscript. Yeah.
So this is not a
Except
question,
for
but
the
a comment.
characters, except for the characters. The
Yes.
characters were strongly there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, not a question, but a comment. A quote on page 60 I found incredibly beautiful and moving. To be little again, living without fear and brutality. No one gets that back. All that is left is a craving, insatiable, empty place.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your words tonight. I have, you can correct me, but I've learned a word that I'm going to say to you. Hi.
Hi.
I had the emphasis on the wrong syllable.
Okay. Syllable. Yeah, you got the wrong syllable. But it's an expression of thanks, and I appreciate that. I do. And I really thank everybody that's here with us tonight. And you know, I love the opportunity to talk about the book to people that are interested in it and are, as you say, taking responsibility for your own education. That's
We deeply appreciate it. So thank you so much.
thank you.
Have a great evening.
You as well. Good night, everybody.
Okay, good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.